The phone call that would shatter everything came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night that had started like any other day in Rebecca Martinez's carefully ordered adult life. She was reviewing patient charts in her Denver apartment when her phone rang with a call from Detective Lisa Chin of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, whose first words would haunt Rebecca for months to come. "Ms. Martinez, we've found human remains on your father's property that we believe belong to your mother, Elena Martinez, who disappeared 23 years ago when you were 10 years old." Rebecca dropped her pen and felt the world tilt beneath her as Detective Chin continued, explaining that construction workers renovating the old Martinez family home had discovered a shallow grave containing skeletal remains, personal jewelry, and fragments of clothing that matched descriptions from the missing person report filed when Elena had vanished without a trace in 1999. But it wasn't just the discovery of her mother's body that made Rebecca's hands shake as she gripped the phone. It was Detective Chen's next revelation that her father, Carlos Martinez, had been arrested an hour earlier and was being held as the primary suspect in Elena's murder, ending 23 years of lies about her mother's mysterious disappearance and forcing Rebecca to confront the horrifying possibility that the man who had raised her as a loving single parent had actually killed her mother and hidden the truth for over 2 decades. Rebecca's childhood memories of her mother's disappearance had been carefully shaped by her father's version of events, a story that portrayed Elena as an unstable woman who had struggled with depression and alcohol abuse before abandoning her family to start a new life somewhere far from Colorado. Carlos had told 10-year-old Rebecca that Elena had left a note saying she needed space to find herself and that she would contact them when she was ready, but that note had supposedly been lost during one of their many moves in the years following Elena's disappearance. As Rebecca grew up, Carlos had gradually revealed more details about Elena's alleged mental health problems, describing episodes of erratic behavior, threats to leave the family, and conflicts with neighbors and employers that had supposedly driven Elena to flee rather than face her responsibilities as a wife and mother. Rebecca had grown up feeling abandoned by a mother she remembered as loving and attentive, but Carlos's explanations had convinced her that Elena's disappearance was the result of personal demons rather than external circumstances. The story Carlos had constructed was so detailed and consistent that Rebecca had never seriously questioned its basic elements, even as she became an adult and developed the analytical skills that came with her career as a forensic accountant. Carlos had explained away every inconsistency in Elena's disappearance, why she had left behind her purse and identification, why she had never contacted Rebecca on birthdays or holidays, why she had never accessed her bank accounts or applied for jobs under her real name. Elena was supposedly living under an assumed identity, possibly in Mexico or another country where she could start fresh without the burden of her previous life. Carlos had even claimed to have hired private investigators over the years who had found traces of Elena in various locations but had been unable to make direct contact because she was actively avoiding her former family. But now, standing in her apartment at midnight while Detective Chin explained the forensic evidence that proved Elena had been murdered and buried on their family property, Rebecca began to see her father's carefully constructed narrative for what it really was. An elaborate cover story designed to hide the fact that he had killed his wife and disposed of her body while convincing their daughter that she had been abandoned rather than orphaned. The skeletal remains had been found buried beneath what had once been Carlos's workshop, a small building behind the main house where he had spent countless hours working on carpentry projects and home repairs. Rebecca remembered that workshop as a place where Carlos would retreat when he needed to think or work through problems, and she had spent many afternoons there helping him with various projects while he told her stories about her mother's irresponsible behavior and explained why Elena's abandonment wasn't Rebecca's fault. Detective Chin arranged to meet Rebecca the next morning at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation headquarters, where she would be shown the evidence that had led to Carlos's arrest and asked to provide information about her parents' relationship and her memories of the time period surrounding Elena's disappearance. The drive to the CBI offices was surreal for Rebecca, who found herself mentally reviewing 23 years of conversations with her father about Elena's disappearance, looking for clues that might have indicated Carlos was lying about what had happened to her mother. Rebecca realized that she had never really questioned why Elena would have left behind not just her family but also her personal belongings, photographs, and mementos that any normal person would have taken when starting a new life. At the CBI headquarters, Detective Chin introduced Rebecca to the forensic team that had been examining the remains found on the Martinez property, and their findings painted a horrifying picture of Elena's final hours. The medical examiner had determined that Elena had died from blunt force trauma to the skull, indicating that she had been struck multiple times with a heavy object in what appeared to be a violent domestic assault. The position of the skeletal remains suggested that Elena had been buried quickly and carelessly, without any attempt at a proper funeral or respectful disposal of her body. More disturbing was the discovery of Elena's wedding ring and a necklace that Rebecca remembered her mother wearing constantly, items that Carlos had claimed Elena had taken with her when she left but which had actually been buried with her body for over 2 decades. The forensic evidence also revealed that Elena had been buried sometime during the winter months, as indicated by soil conditions and the presence of certain insects and plant materials that would have been consistent with a December or January burial. This timing contradicted Carlos's story about Elena leaving in the spring, when the weather would have been warmer and travel would have been easier for someone supposedly starting a new life in a distant location. Detective Chin explained that the forensic timeline suggested Elena had been killed and buried around Christmas of 1999, meaning that Rebecca had spent that holiday season playing in the backyard just a few feet from her mother's hidden grave, while Carlos maintained the fiction that Elena was simply taking time to sort out her problems before returning to the family. Rebecca's interview with Detective Chen lasted 6 hours, during which she was asked to recall every detail she could remember about her parents' relationship, Elena's behavior in the months before her disappearance, and Carlos's actions and statements during the period when Elena was supposedly missing. The detective was particularly interested in Rebecca's memories of the family's financial situation, as forensic accountants working on the case had discovered that Carlos had been facing serious money problems in 1999, including business debts, gambling losses, and potential bankruptcy that could have created stress in his marriage to Elena. Rebecca learned that Elena had been working as a bookkeeper for a local construction company and had apparently discovered that Carlos had been forging her signature on loan documents and using their home as collateral for debts that could have resulted in the loss of their property and Rebecca's college fund. The investigation revealed that Elena had been planning to leave Carlos and had been secretly meeting with a divorce attorney in the weeks before her death, gathering financial records that would have exposed Carlos's fraudulent use of their shared assets and potentially resulted in criminal charges for forgery and theft. Elena had also been preparing to file for full custody of Rebecca, as she had discovered evidence that Carlos had been gambling away money that was supposed to be saved for their daughter's education and future needs. The divorce attorney, who had kept Elena's file for over 2 decades in case she ever returned, provided investigators with copies of financial documents that showed the extent of Carlos's deception and the likelihood that Elena's efforts to protect her daughter's future had motivated Carlos to kill her rather than face the legal and financial consequences of his actions. Detective Chin explained that the investigation had also uncovered evidence suggesting that Carlos had been planning Elena's murder for several weeks before actually carrying it out. Credit card records showed that Carlos had purchased lime, heavy-duty garbage bags, and a shovel in the days before Elena's death, items that had no legitimate purpose given the season and Carlos's supposed construction projects. More damning was the discovery that Carlos had taken out a large life insurance policy on Elena just 6 months before her death, a policy that had paid out over $200,000 after Elena was declared legally dead 7 years later. Carlos had used the insurance money to pay off his debts and purchase a new home, all while maintaining the fiction that Elena might someday return to their family. The most devastating revelation came when Detective Chen showed Rebecca evidence that Carlos had been actively working to prevent Elena from being found for over 2 decades. Phone records revealed that Carlos had contacted the private investigators he had supposedly hired to search for Elena, but rather than asking them to find her, he had been paying them to create false reports suggesting that Elena was alive and living in various distant locations. Carlos had also been monitoring missing person databases and social media sites, not to find Elena but to ensure that no one was getting close to discovering what had actually happened to her. When Elena's case had been featured on television programs about missing persons, Carlos had called the show's producers with additional false information designed to send investigators in the wrong directions. Rebecca's world was further shattered when Detective Chen revealed that Carlos had been telling different stories about Elena's disappearance to different people over the years, tailoring his narrative to whatever audience would be most likely to believe his version of events. To Rebecca, he had portrayed Elena as mentally unstable and irresponsible. To Elena's family in Mexico, he had claimed that Elena had run off with another man and wanted no contact with her relatives. To neighbors and friends, he had suggested that Elena had been involved in illegal activities and had fled to avoid prosecution. To Elena's employer, he had said that Elena had suffered a nervous breakdown and was receiving treatment at an undisclosed medical facility. The consistency of Carlos's lies to Rebecca had been maintained precisely because she was the only person who had regular, ongoing contact with him, allowing him to carefully control the narrative she received while telling completely different stories to others. The investigation also revealed that several people had tried to report suspicious circumstances surrounding Elena's disappearance over the years, but their concerns had been dismissed by local law enforcement agencies that were not equipped to handle complex missing person cases involving potential domestic violence. Elena's sister, Maria, had contacted police multiple times to report that Elena would never have voluntarily lost contact with Rebecca, whom she adored, and that Carlos's explanations for Elena's disappearance were inconsistent and suspicious. Elena's best friend, Sandra, had told police that Elena had been afraid of Carlos in the weeks before her disappearance and had mentioned concerns about her safety. Even some of Rebecca's teachers had reported to school counselors that Rebecca's behavior had changed dramatically after Elena's disappearance in ways that suggested trauma rather than simple sadness about an absent parent. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was evidence that Carlos had been psychologically manipulating Rebecca throughout her childhood and adolescence, using Elena's supposed abandonment as a tool to ensure Rebecca's complete dependence on him and prevent her from asking uncomfortable questions about her mother's disappearance. Carlos had systematically isolated Rebecca from Elena's family and friends, claiming that contact with them would be too painful given Elena's rejection of her daughter. He had also used Elena's alleged mental illness and irresponsibility as examples of what happened to people who didn't appreciate their families, subtly threatening Rebecca that she could face similar consequences if she didn't remain loyal and obedient to him. Rebecca's relationship with her father had been the central foundation of her adult life, and learning that Carlos was not only a murderer but also a master manipulator who had spent decades lying to her about the most important event in her childhood forced her to question every memory, conversation, and emotional connection she had formed over 23 years. The man she had loved and trusted as her devoted single father had actually killed her mother and then used Elena's death as a means of controlling and manipulating Rebecca's entire psychological development. Carlos had stolen not just Elena's life but also Rebecca's right to grieve properly for her mother and understand the truth about her family history. The legal proceedings that followed Carlos's arrest were complicated by the passage of time and the sophisticated nature of his deception, but the physical evidence of Elena's murder was overwhelming and undeniable. Carlos initially maintained his innocence and continued to claim that Elena had left voluntarily, even when confronted with her skeletal remains and the forensic evidence proving she had been killed and buried on his property. His defense attorney argued that someone else could have killed Elena and buried her body on the Martinez property without Carlos's knowledge, but this explanation was contradicted by the evidence showing Carlos's detailed planning and his systematic efforts to prevent Elena from being found. During the trial, Rebecca was forced to testify about her memories of her parents' relationship and her father's behavior in the months and years following Elena's disappearance. The testimony was emotionally devastating, as Rebecca had to publicly acknowledge that her entire understanding of her childhood and family history had been based on lies told by her mother's murderer. The defense attorney tried to suggest that Rebecca's memories were unreliable or that she had been influenced by investigators to interpret her father's actions in a more sinister light, but Rebecca's detailed recollections and the corroborating physical evidence made it clear that Carlos had been carefully constructing and maintaining his deception for over 2 decades. The trial also featured testimony from Elena's family and friends, who described a woman very different from the unstable, irresponsible person Carlos had portrayed to Rebecca. Elena had been a dedicated mother who had been planning to leave an increasingly dangerous marriage in order to protect her daughter from Carlos's gambling problems and financial irresponsibility. Elena's sister Maria testified that Elena had been afraid Carlos would try to prevent her from taking Rebecca, and that Elena had been planning to seek help from domestic violence resources before she was killed. Elena's friend Sandra testified that Elena had been excited about the possibility of starting a new life with Rebecca away from Carlos's control and manipulation. The most powerful testimony came from the divorce attorney Elena had been working with, who revealed the extent of Carlos's financial crimes and the evidence Elena had been gathering to protect Rebecca's future. Elena had discovered that Carlos had forged her signature on multiple loan documents, had been gambling away money from Rebecca's college fund, and had been lying to Elena about their family's true financial situation. Elena's efforts to document these crimes and seek legal protection for herself and Rebecca had apparently motivated Carlos to kill her rather than face the consequences of his actions being exposed in divorce proceedings. Carlos was convicted on charges of first-degree murder, fraud, insurance fraud, and child endangerment, and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The conviction provided some sense of justice for Elena's family and friends, but it could not undo 23 years of lies or restore the relationship between Rebecca and her mother that had been stolen by Carlos's crime. More importantly, the trial revealed the extent to which domestic violence and financial abuse could escalate to murder when perpetrators felt threatened by their victims' attempts to seek help or escape dangerous relationships. The aftermath of Carlos's conviction forced Rebecca to completely reconstruct her understanding of her childhood, her relationship with her parents, and her own identity as an adult who had been shaped by decades of manipulation and deception. Rebecca entered therapy to process the complex trauma of learning that her beloved father was actually her mother's murderer and that her entire childhood narrative had been carefully constructed to hide this crime. The therapy process was particularly difficult because Rebecca had to grieve not only for the mother she had lost but also for the father she had thought she had, who had never actually existed except as a persona Carlos had created to manipulate her. Rebecca also had to cope with intense guilt about her failure to recognize signs that her father had been lying about Elena's disappearance, even though child development experts explained that it would have been impossible for a 10-year-old to see through such sophisticated deception by a trusted adult. Rebecca struggled with questions about whether she could have done something differently as she got older, whether she should have been more suspicious of inconsistencies in Carlos's story, and whether her acceptance of his narrative had somehow betrayed her mother's memory. The therapy process helped Rebecca understand that she had been a victim of Carlos's manipulation just as much as Elena had been a victim of his violence. One of the most difficult aspects of Rebecca's healing process was learning to separate her genuine childhood memories of Elena from the negative stories Carlos had told her over the years. Rebecca worked with therapists and Elena's family members to reconstruct a more accurate picture of her mother as a loving, responsible woman who had been trying to protect her daughter from an increasingly dangerous husband. Home videos, photographs, and letters that Elena's family had preserved helped Rebecca remember the real Elena rather than the caricature Carlos had created to justify her disappearance. Rebecca also had to navigate complex relationships with Elena's extended family, who had been excluded from her life for over 2 decades based on Carlos's lies. Elena's parents had died believing their daughter had abandoned her family, and Elena's siblings had spent years wondering what had happened to their sister and trying to maintain some connection with Rebecca despite Carlos's efforts to isolate her from them. Rebuilding these relationships required Rebecca to acknowledge how completely she had been manipulated by Carlos while also recognizing that Elena's family had their own grief and anger about losing both Elena and their relationship with Rebecca. The discovery of Elena's murder also had significant implications for Rebecca's career as a forensic accountant, as she realized that the analytical skills she had developed professionally could have been applied to examining the inconsistencies in Carlos's financial explanations for Elena's disappearance. Rebecca struggled with the irony that she had built her career on detecting financial fraud and deception while accepting at face value her father's lies about gambling debts and business problems that had supposedly motivated Elena to leave. The experience ultimately made Rebecca more effective in her professional work, as she developed a deeper understanding of how financial abuse and deception could be used to control and manipulate family members. Rebecca used her experience to become an advocate for missing person cases involving potential domestic violence, working with law enforcement agencies to improve their response to reports of suspicious disappearances and helping families navigate the complex process of searching for missing loved ones. She discovered that Elena's case was unfortunately not unique. Many missing person reports involve domestic violence victims who have been killed by their abusers, and families are often given false hope that their loved ones are still alive when they have actually been murdered and their bodies hidden. Rebecca also worked with organizations that provide support to children who have lost parents to domestic violence, helping young people understand that they are not responsible for their parents' actions and that it is possible to heal from the trauma of family violence even when the truth is hidden for many years. Rebecca's work in this area was particularly meaningful because she understood from personal experience how domestic violence could affect children in ways that might not be recognized for decades, and how important it was for young people to receive accurate information about their family histories rather than being protected by lies that could cause additional trauma when the truth was eventually revealed. 5 years after Carlos's conviction, Rebecca established the Elena Martinez Foundation, a non-profit organization that provides resources for families of missing persons and advocates for improved law enforcement response to cases involving potential domestic violence. The foundation funds training programs for police officers and social workers who work with missing person cases, provides financial assistance to families who cannot afford private investigators or legal help, and maintains a database of missing person cases that may involve domestic violence to help identify patterns and connect related cases. The Foundation's work has led to the resolution of several other long-term missing person cases, including situations where family members had been told their loved ones had left voluntarily when they had actually been killed by abusive partners or relatives. Rebecca's advocacy has also contributed to changes in law enforcement procedures for handling missing person reports, including requirements for more thorough investigation of domestic violence history and better coordination between agencies when missing person cases cross jurisdictional boundaries. Rebecca's personal healing process required years of therapy and support, but she eventually reached a place where she could honor both Elena's memory and her own survival of Carlos's psychological manipulation. Rebecca learned to separate her legitimate grief for Elena from the false guilt Carlos had instilled in her about supposedly driving her mother away through typical childhood behavior. She also learned to appreciate Elena's courage in trying to protect Rebecca by seeking a divorce and gathering evidence of Carlos's financial crimes, even though that courage had ultimately led to Elena's death. The most meaningful aspect of Rebecca's healing came through her relationship with Elena's grave, which had been relocated to a proper cemetery and marked with a headstone that accurately reflected Elena's life as a loving mother and dedicated woman who had died trying to protect her daughter. Rebecca visits Elena's grave regularly, bringing updates about her advocacy work, her career achievements, and the ways that Elena's story has helped other families find missing loved ones or escape from dangerous relationships. Rebecca has also planted a garden at Elena's gravesite with flowers that Elena had loved, creating a peaceful place where she can feel connected to the mother she lost as a child. 10 years after Elena's body was discovered, Rebecca still struggles with the complexity of grieving for someone whose death was hidden from her for most of her life, but she has found meaning and purpose in ensuring that Elena's story helps prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. Rebecca's work has contributed to the identification and prosecution of several other domestic violence murderers who had convinced families that their victims had left voluntarily, and has helped establish legal protections for children who lose parents to domestic violence. Rebecca learned that the most important lesson from her experience was that the truth, no matter how painful, is ultimately more healing than lies designed to protect people from difficult realities. Carlos had claimed that his deception was motivated by love and a desire to protect Rebecca from knowing that her mother had been murdered, but his lies had actually prolonged Rebecca's trauma and prevented her from properly grieving Elena's death or understanding her mother's courage in trying to escape a dangerous marriage. Rebecca's discovery of the truth, while devastating, had ultimately allowed her to honor Elena's memory accurately and build a life based on reality rather than carefully constructed fiction. The experience also taught Rebecca about the importance of supporting other people who discover that their family histories are different from what they had been told, whether because of domestic violence, adoption, or other circumstances that create family secrets. Rebecca's advocacy work includes educational programs about the long-term effects of family deception on children and the importance of providing age-appropriate but honest information about difficult family circumstances rather than creating elaborate cover stories that may eventually cause additional trauma when the truth is discovered. Today, Rebecca continues her work as both a forensic accountant and victim advocate, using her professional skills to help identify financial abuse and her personal experience to support families affected by domestic violence and missing person cases. Elena's murder remains a central part of Rebecca's identity and mission, but it no longer defines her life in terms of loss and deception. Instead, Rebecca has transformed her experience into a source of strength and expertise that helps other families find truth, justice, and healing even in the most difficult circumstances. Elena's courage in trying to protect Rebecca ultimately inspired Rebecca's own courage in seeking truth and justice for other families, creating a legacy of protection and advocacy that extends far beyond the grave where Elena's body was hidden for over 2 decades.